Good afternoon. My name is Sean DeRath, and I'm the Research Coordinator at the BC Centre for Employment Excellence, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our centre, it was created 2 years ago with funding from the provincial and federal governments to act as a research and knowledge-sharing organization for BC employment service providers and employers. The centre's mandate is not only to do innovative research, but also to find ways to share that knowledge and best practices with BC practitioners and employers. We created this webinar series last year as a way to reach out and connect with practitioners. Through this series, we have been highlighting new research by the Centre, but we are also tapping into the knowledge and expertise within the employment services community. You're invited to view the video recordings of previous webinars that we've posted on our website. Today we will be presenting one of our three-part series on understanding current employment programming and services for BC youth. Last November, we issued an open call for researchers to submit proposals to explore barriers affecting BC youth employment from a variety of angles. The purpose of this call was to provide new insights and understanding into the challenges that youth are facing in the labor market, and to identify promising solutions for such issues as supporting youth who are entering the labor market or helping them find work that is a better match for their skills. Through the call, the Centre was able to support 5 projects that tackled such issues as the barriers experienced by vulnerable youth, as well as youth living with mental illness, the role that employers can play in addressing the problem, and the promise that work placements and social enterprises hold in addressing work transitions for specific populations of youth. The research teams have now completed their work, and the Centre will be publishing the papers on its website over the next month. To mark this occasion, we have invited each of the teams to present their findings to our stakeholders across the province through this series of webinars. During the first of today's 2 presentations, Tom Zizys will present his study of demand-led labor market strategies to improve employment outcomes for BC youth. Tom is a Toronto-based analyst whose research work focuses on the demand side of the labor market and its implications for employment programs and workforce development strategies. Most of his work is on behalf of workforce planning boards, employment agencies, educational institutions, and municipalities in Ontario. He is also an Innovation Fellow of the Metcalfe Foundation, examining the changing labor market and its impact on the working poor. In the second presentation, Sarah Amiot and Christy Farrell-Mader will present on pathways to success for youth in BC's capital region, the power and potential of social enterprise in high-demand sectors. Sarah is a program manager for the Community Social Planning Council, responsible for the organization's community economic development programs. She has a wealth of experience in community development. Prior to joining the council, she worked as a researcher with the Canadian Social Economy Hub, the Measuring the Cooperative Difference Network, and the Manitoba Research Alliance on Community Economic Development. She has a first-hand understanding of the passion, commitment, and work that goes into growing a social enterprise, having led the development of a social enterprise cafe, where she says that she spent countless hours washing dishes in the process. Christy is a founder and member of Scale Collaborative, an organization that is supporting social innovation and social enterprise in BC. Christy has a long history in youth work, community development, and social enterprise. She helped found the Cleaning Solution, which I'm sure many of you know of as being a highly successful social enterprise that is creating employment in Vancouver. Since moving to Victoria in 2011, Christy has been engaged in supporting social enterprise and green economic development in the region. She's inspired by social enterprise as a powerful force for innovation and the potential for economic development that addresses deep social and environmental issues. Before I turn it over to Tom to do our first presentation today, I have a few housekeeping items. We're trying something new here today at the Centre, where we have 3 presenters joining us remotely from 3 separate locations. Now, we don't anticipate any technical difficulties, but we will appreciate your patience in case we experience any issues. Each presentation will last approximately 20 to 25 minutes. Due to the number of participants, we will be muting the audience throughout the presentation to ensure audio quality. We do encourage you to use the questions feature on your dashboard to submit any comments or questions you may have. My colleague Greg here will be compiling the questions, and we will have time at the end of each presentation for the teams to address them. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting the video on our website, along with a link to the presentation slides, with further opportunities for everyone to continue the conversation with the presenters and other practitioners. I should let you know that if you do lose your internet connection during the presentation, please reconnect using the link emailed to you. If you lose your phone connection, redial the phone number which appears in the info tab and then rejoin. And now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Tom.
Hi there. I'm just getting my presentation loaded up onto the screen. Good afternoon. Let me make sure, Sean, that people can see this.
Yeah, we can see it just fine.
Okay, great. All right. So just to give a bit of a roadmap of what I'll be presenting today, I'm going to talk about the background of this study, about why I undertook this study and the approach that I applied. I'm going to go over some data relating to labor market outcomes for British Columbia youth, define what I mean by demand-side approaches, and talk about how that might apply to youth programming, and then look at some practices of employers who currently engage in workforce development, promising workforce development activities in relation to youth, and then toward the end, talk about recommendations. So, as Sean mentioned, my background is as a labor market analyst, and I came to this function because around 10, 12 years ago, I was working far more on employment services, designing employment programs, particularly for homeless populations, youth, newcomers, primarily in Toronto, but also through Southern Ontario. And despite all our best efforts, I often found that I guess our expectations of how effective these programs could be never really materialized as much in practice. People would get assistance and then would be back at our services 3 or 6 months later. And so I started to research the best practices in the United States relating to employment services. And I found it interesting that over the course of several years, there was a whole trajectory of improvements to employment services. We looked at different forms of job search techniques, assistance with resume writing, helping with interview skills, on and on, the stuff that's listed on the screen, recognizing that sometimes people who had been out of work for a while needed more pre-employment assistance transition into the workplace. People who got a job sometimes had difficulty retaining a job, so we looked at job retention services. Sometimes the first job really didn't pay enough, and so the standard of what was a success was if we could get them to advance to the next job. Clients often faced numerous other challenges in terms of their personal lives or their domestic situation, and we ended up looking at how we include other services, that perhaps the services were too scattered, and so we had to. Anyway, the long and short of it was, so much of it was focused on the supply side, and actually we found, in the United States, as they moved into this area, that with the workfare programs in the mid-90s, that yes, they were placing people in jobs, but the moment the economy turned sour, particularly with the bust of the dot-com boom, the first people to lose their work were those who were had tenuous connections with the labor market. The problem is that the labor market has changed over the last 30 years. Entry-level jobs were not what they used to be, and particularly people who were new entrants to the labor market, and that's primarily youth and newcomers, they're the ones who are most challenged. in terms of labor market successes. We've heard a lot of talk about how we were moving to a knowledge economy, and so the seeking higher levels of education were very important. What we're finding in Canada, when Canada has the highest proportion of post-secondary graduates in its workforce in the world, what we're finding is that we also have the highest proportion of people with post-secondary degrees who are earning less than half the median income, which is a standard measure of poverty. So we have high levels of education, but a significant portion of people with post-secondary degrees are ending up in jobs that require no more than a high school education. And meanwhile, even with these high levels of education, employers are saying they can't find qualified job candidates. So long and short of it is, with all this focus on the supply side, something else, sorry about that, something else seems to be happening. And so I come to this to say that, yes, what we do on the supply side is important, but we seem to be ignoring things that are happening on the demand side as well. So the way this study was organized, as I said, I looked at some data that I'm going to present on labor market outcomes of youth, define more what is the demand side approach and how it might be applied to youth, and look to see what appetite there is on the part of employers to adopt some of these approaches. So the methodology looked at labor force survey data and National Household Survey, the voluntary survey that accompanied the census in 2011, did a literature review, and then both did an internet search and interviewed a number of employers based on the top employers for young people list for Canada. Okay. In terms of the data, the general data relating to 15 and 24-year-olds, we know that in British Columbia and across Canada, and frankly in most industrialized countries in the world, youth tend to have unemployment rates that are around twice that of adults. This is nothing new. Since around the late 1990s, youth have been experiencing unemployment rates at that level. Those unemployment rates are higher for 15 to 19-year-olds. They're higher for youth who have no high school diploma, certainly. Participation rates have been dropping on the part of youth. That is not a bad thing. Youth are staying in school longer, and so they're not joining the labor force until later. The participation rates particularly have dropped among 15 and 19-year-olds and among those who have no high school certificate, because all it means is that they're staying in school. They're not going into the job market. School attendance figures in terms of staying in high school and attending post-secondary education have been rising in British Columbia and rising elsewhere. So these slides, refer to the quality of jobs that people have when they are in the labor market, looking at 15 to 24-year-olds in British Columbia and also comparing them to Canada. So the top slide, incidence of temporary work. So temporary work includes working for a temp agency, working in seasonal work and casual work, working on contract, so of a limited term. You could see the blue line represents the 15 to 24-year increase, rising from below 20% to now roughly 30% of youth work in temporary jobs. In a similar way, part-time work, the incidence of part-time work has been rising among youth from around the mid-30s to around the mid-45%, around 45% in around 25 years or so. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the levels of educational attainment have been increasing. So the slide on the left shows the proportions of youth, 15 to 24-year-olds, by different levels of educational attainment. And the major difference on the left-hand side, the bar in blue, in the 10 years between 2001 and 2011, the share of youth with no high school diploma has dropped from 29 to 18%, whereas at the other extreme, I guess that's aquamarine, the share of youth with university degrees has increased substantially from 6 to 14%. So then what I did is I looked at the data regarding specific occupations, and I identified what I called youth jobs. And those were jobs that had at least 25% of the people working in those jobs were 15 to 24 years old. And I identified around 35 such occupations, included positions, as you see there, as like retail salespeople, cashiers, food counter attendants, landscapers, and so on. So if you looked at the proportion of youth in those jobs, like the likelihood of a youth being in those jobs, in 2000, youth were around 2.5 times as likely to be in those jobs compared to their share of the entire workforce. Okay, that share stayed roughly the same in 2005, but by 2011, youth were 3 times as likely to be in youth jobs. And what I find striking is, again, when we look to the panel on the left, as their educational attainment is growing, their propensity to actually be in youth jobs, which typically require no more than a high school diploma and sometimes not even a high school diploma, that tendency has increased. In fact, among 25 and 34-year-olds with a post-secondary degree, around 12% of them in British Columbia work in a youth job. It's not a huge amount, but it's a significant amount. These are people who now have finished school, they're in the labor market in a permanent way, and despite having a post-secondary degree, around 12% of them work in a youth job. What's the context for why this has happened? Well, in the previous paradigm, people typically worked for only 2 or 3 employers in their lifetime, and they ended up coming into an entry-level job and progressing to higher levels of education. We've had many changes in the labor market, but the major one has been we don't have permanent employment with 1 or 2 employers. So as a result, employers are essentially hired just in time. When they hire just in time, they're looking at credentials. They don't know the people. Those people have not developed over the course of the last few years in their workplace. And so credentials and resumes now become important. Meanwhile, the cost cutting that's taken place in the labor market has typically been at the expense of entry-level jobs. Entry-level jobs are contracted out, are outsourced overseas, are automated. And so entry-level jobs are typically not the stepping stone to a career. So despite the fact that the workforce has increased its educational attainment, employers are saying they can't find qualified workers. And in my view, I think it's not so much that there's a skill shortage, but there's an experience shortage. The experience one used to get in the workplace is not available anymore, and as a result, we have poor transitions into the labor market. Okay, what do we mean by a demand-side approach then? It means putting the same kind of focus on the employer as one does when one is an employment service as you do on your client. It's actually trying to understand the particular needs of that employer's circumstances, and it doesn't necessarily mean only taking the employer's view of what they need. In the same way we look at a client and make assessments about what their strengths and weaknesses are, I think we have to do the same thing with employers, identifying to what extent are they using the skills that are available to them. Do they provide training? Do they provide pathways for people to advance to better jobs, whether better paying jobs or more permanent jobs, and so on. But it does mean, unlike with employment services, that one often needs a collective strategy, because understanding that the circumstances of one individual employer will only get you so far. Specific sectors have their own dynamics in terms of occupations, in terms of the changing skill mix in their companies, and so working with groups of similarly placed employers in the same industry sector or subsector is really critical. employers do not engage in training just because it makes business sense. There's a lot of literature out there that shows that training improves the bottom line, but employers are really challenged because of the cost. They're worried that you spend the money now, but the impact of the training may be a year or two from now. So there's a sense of risk. They may not have the information. They don't know which training resource to go to. They're worried that their worker is going to leave elsewhere to go to another employer once they get trained. They're sometimes just happy to leave things the way they are. For that reason, a lot of these issues can be addressed if one takes a collective approach, engages a group of employers so you can have economies of scale in terms of information dissemination, in terms of the training, in terms of dealing with the concern of poaching. Demand side has a particular lens when it looks at skills development. That skills it's a process. We start laying the foundation for skills in schools, but the transition to the workplace is really important. Acquiring that experience either through co-op programs or internships or mentorships is really critical. And then even once you're in the workplace, having those skills applied, getting the take-up of those skills, particularly for career advancement, is really critical. So for each of those three columns, skills creation, skills application, skill usage, let me talk a bit about how that applies to youth. On the skills creation side, do schools understand what employers need? Do we have good linkages between schools and employers? Do employers understand what schools can provide and what they can't provide? Is it fair for employers to expect that schools can produce people who are entirely job ready? On the other hand, in terms of actual transition into the workplace, do schools have those linkages with employers so that we can develop co-op programs and internship programs, workplace visits? In terms of the actual hiring processes, are employers doing all they can to ensure they access youth? Are they using social media to recruit youth? If many employers hire through word of mouth, those are channels that actually exclude many youth because youth may not have the social networks. Is the requirement of a bachelor's or a post-secondary education absolutely necessary for every occupation that's being recruited for? Employers would do a good job if they simply provided feedback to unsuccessful candidates about identifying what they did right and what they did wrong in a job interview, for example. In terms of the actual work in the workplace, are skills actually being used? And you know, we have a lot of studies that talk about the extent to which Canada lags in productivity growth and innovation in comparison to other jurisdictions, and I think that is a reflection of some of our human resources practices, and that's particularly relevant to youth because if employers put more emphasis on developing their human capital, youth would be the ones who would benefit the most. So in terms of making sure that demand-focused strategies can move forward, we need more intermediaries that bring together employment services and educators on the one hand and employers on the other hand, workforce intermediaries or what we call workforce planning boards, engaging employer associations and applying sector strategies and ensuring that there are linkages with schools. I know Sean's probably going to give me a wave in a moment. I know I've got only around a minute or two left. Let me just say that when I looked at what employers are currently doing, you've got a range of employers, some of whom pay no attention to this and some of whom very, very much engage in this stuff. So on this slide, there's a whole series of activities that employers who are, I guess, at the progressive end of the scale, who put a lot of their attention on specifically doing, engaging in practices that draw youth into their workforce and that develop youth at an early stage, whether it's through paid internship or providing internal career guidance, structured learning opportunities within the workplace. Okay. A couple of the companies I looked at, I also sought why they might do this. And here there's a profiling several of them. Most of them were had a variety. None of them were articulating a sense that they were specifically targeting youth. Some of them, it was just part of their corporate culture that they invested in their workforce. Costco is a good example of a company that pays well at the entry-level stage, and most of whose supervisors and managers have worked their way up within the system. It's kind of an old-style corporate model. Whereas on the other hand, a University of British Columbia recognized that they had a natural resource because of the youth that attend there, and they had a very attractive coaching program, and so they started profiling that in terms of attracting more youth to join their workforce. TELUS, on the other hand, their mission was they wanted to really ensure that customer service was they were branded in that sense. But they realized in order to make customer service their main mission, they needed a happy employee, and good workforce practices was how they got there, and those in particularly were beneficial to youth. In terms of specific policy recommendations, what we came up with was, first of all, that if British Columbia were to want to bring some balance to its labor market policy, so it's not only supply side focused, it has to really be clear and deliberate about articulating a demand side approach. That regional workforce tables that have been started in British Columbia and probably are still finding their feet, those need to be supported in a larger way, particularly to adopt a demand-side approach, using sector strategies and also engaging employers' associations in order to ensure that the demand-side approach can be fulfilled. Small and medium-sized enterprises are more challenged to engage in this kind of work because they don't have their own HR departments, and so special attention needs to be given to them. Finally, I think it would be really relevant for us to define what we think are good employers' practices, and to have community groups and others profile and celebrate employers who do engage in practices that are beneficial to youth in terms of paid internships, in terms of ensuring there are opportunities for career advancement. I think there's value to giving that kind of message to employers. So I'll end it there, and look forward to any questions people would have at the end of the presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's a pretty quick overview of a pretty dense report, and we'll be excited for people to read your report when it comes out, hopefully next week. We do have a couple questions. On slide 6, Tom, you had some changing some of the trends that were going on, and there's a question from Mike Jones about whether you would expect a rise in the trades category based on the trends that you're seeing.
A rise in the trends category.
In the trades category.
Trades category. Again, there might be a peculiar circumstance in British Columbia, but I will say in many other countries are also challenged to have more youth take up the trades, and I think it's partly has to do with societal views of what kind of status they assign to occupations, and I think what we're finding is that youth who have among their family members or neighbors people who are involved in the trades are more likely to take up trades, but there's it's very hard to when we give more status to professional occupations, it's very hard to convince youth that trades, which are terrific jobs, well-paying, engage people's minds and creativity, it's much harder to recruit them into those positions that we've been seeing dropping applications in those areas, except where we've had strong government programs to try and change that trend.
Okay. Thanks. And then we have a question from Tammy Lawley about one of the examples you used. You talked about Costco and some of the best practices that they exhibit. The question is, using an example like Costco, there's a concern that they hire from within. Is this something that I don't know if you've had a chance to talk with them, but is this actually an opportunity for youth at Costco to actually get into that workplace?
Well, let's put it this way. I think if I were a youth, I would certainly think hard between choosing if I wanted to go into retail, and especially in a large box retail, whether I wanted to go to Costco or to Walmart. The turnover levels at Costco are much lower. The pay is higher, and the opportunities for advancement are higher. So yeah, I think in every sector we find you can make an assessment of employers on those characteristics. So it's not simply, do I want to go into retail trade or do I want to go into the food and accommodation services field? I think within each of those categories, you have some employers who have workforce practices that are much more beneficial for the long term. And I think that's the kind of research we need to do, and that's why we might want to identify what some of those practices are so that we showcase it both to change the norms and values people have about what we expect of employers, but also to signal to job seekers where they want to put their attention.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we will have an opportunity at the end to ask more questions, so if you think of any more for Tom, he's going to stay on the line and he'll be available after the next presentation. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Christy to present on social enterprises in the capital region.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't hear Christy.
Christy's on the line, and she was wondering about her ability to speak as well. Are you able to activate her microphone?
I'm afraid she'll have to unmute herself.
Okay, well, while she tries to figure that out, so Christy, if you could try to unmute yourself, I'll just introduce us quickly. So my name is Sarah Amiot. I work with the Community Social Planning Council in Greater Victoria, as Sean mentioned. And together with Christy Fairholm-Mader, our study looked at a specific type of business, a specific type of employment supports that are offered by social enterprise. And we're interested in how social enterprise could be applied to some of the unique labor market dynamics that exist in the capital region of British Columbia.
Great. I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Good timing.
Okay, perfect. Hi, this is Christy Fairholm-Mader. Thanks, Sarah, for starting us off. And I'll do the first half of the presentation talking about social employment, social enterprise, and then Sarah will talk a little bit more about what we learned from the capital region interviews and focus groups that we did. So we focused specifically on employment social enterprises, and employment social enterprises are, I would say, a growing sector in BC and across Canada and the States and UK and lots of areas where it's looking specifically at how to provide employment and wraparound supports and training to people who may face multiple barriers to employment. And so when we talk about youth, there's lots of different youth that are facing unemployment and high rates of unemployment in Canada, and the employment social enterprises that we looked at specifically was for youth who have significant barriers to the workforce. So some of the things that we want to recognize is that social enterprise has still lots of different definitions, and social enterprises can operate as nonprofit enterprises, they can operate as co-ops, that there's a new legal definition around called CCCs, community contribution corporations, and so what we're really looking at is having some combination of wraparound supports, training, and real paid employment for real work. So the enterprises that are employing people actually operate within the marketplace. And that's a really key part in terms of they're integrated already into the marketplace. Okay, Sarah, can you go to the next slide? So what we find is that it really combines the best practices in employment development. So that it meets labor market needs. There's a sense of, it changes the relationship that the youth or the people who are employed by social enterprises have. It's not a service relationship, but rather it's an employee relationship. So already it's preparing them for the market, the workforce and labor market, because they're employees. They're not receiving services. It also helps them to achieve applied certifications and training that again is relevant to the labor market. The social enterprises really sort of go above and beyond. They work alongside with youth. They employ the youth. They see the day-to-day crises that may be happening. They both sort of look at what the job skills are, but also the workplace skills. So what do you need to do in terms of turning up on time and dealing with conflict and acting as a team member, and all the things that are done that are not necessarily related specifically to what the job is that they are doing, but all the stuff around them that helps them stay employed. And then the other aspect around it is providing support for, we would say, sort of the life skills, the things that are happening outside of work that impact work. So helping them with housing, literacy, you know, dealing with drug and alcohol addictions, all that kind of stuff. Social enterprises will include that in their wraparound supports. Mostly with youth social enterprises, and there's lots of different social enterprises that have different mandates, employing people living with mental illness, employing people with different disabilities, employing people coming out of the prison system. For youth social enterprises, we see that most of those enterprises tend to offer transitional employment. So they'll have more of a limited time frame on how long they employ youth, and then try to transition them into mainstream employment. Next slide, Sarah. So as part of our research project, we interviewed 4 youth social enterprises across Canada. We interviewed Loft Kitchen, who operates out of Toronto, Mission Possible. They have a partnership with, it's called the Work-Life Program, and they provide property management services. There is the Keener's Car Wash, which is in Vancouver, and they do car wash services. And then there is Train for Trades, which is out in Newfoundland. So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about Train for Trades and tell the story of just who they are and how they operate, and that will give you an idea of just how these social enterprises work. So Train for Trades is in St. John's, Newfoundland, and they started by they operate as a nonprofit organization called Choices for Youth, and they've had an opportunity to be involved in a renovation of a building. And so they thought, well, you know, we're working with all these youth that are having different problems. Why don't we employ our youth to do that renovation? And so they did some research, and they looked around at different models such as Eva's Phoenix, which is in Toronto, and Warm Up Winnipeg, the Build model, which is in Winnipeg, and thought that, you know, we can do something like this in St. John's. So they started doing that, and they found that it was very successful. They got contracts, they developed a relationship with the Newfoundland Housing Association, and after they kind of got things going and did construction and retrofit stuff, they got the contract to do the energy retrofit upgrades for social housing in St. John's. And then from there, they've grown, and so they don't do just energy retrofits anymore, but they also do construction. So they have a program, and what they provide is they provide training, and so they really provide specific skills and training around safety and how to operate on a construction site, how to gain the skills, how to use tools, and they partner that with certified training from one of their partners, which is I think it's the Carter's, I want to say it's the Carpenters Mills Right College. So they actually, the youth go and get trained and supported in that program, and then they work and apply those skills within the social enterprise. They provide employment, so they make sure that it's industry-driven and it's meaningful work. Youth have the opportunity to gain the skills and the experience in construction and energy efficiency retrofit. And they also learn to build on this knowledge and to manage a job. And then they provide very intensive supports, and they help the youth to develop a personal plan for success and to stabilize their lives and to be able to identify what are their goals in their life as they move forward in employment or in education. And they ground it all by saying, you know, we do real pay for real work. So they take about 30 youth a year, and they're referred in from different employment support agencies, and they do sort of an assessment and find out where they're at. And they really focus on youth with barriers to employment. They may have housing barriers, they may have literacy, involvement with criminal system, criminal justice, addiction, family breakdown, mental health. And their one requirement for the youth is that the youth need to be ready to make a change. And the youth are between ages of 18 to 25 years old. They staff it with a support team. And so they have a program, they have like a business person who runs the business, they have people who support the youth on site, so the youth are always supervised on site. And then they provide youth workers as well who help them deal with sort of the life stabilization. They provide 24/7 support, and so when I was talking to the person who runs the business, she was telling me that they have cell phones on them, and during the time the youth are encouraged to reach out to them whenever stuff comes up for them. They do a GED preparation program, and they bring a teacher on who helps the youth to achieve their GED. They do essential skills tutoring, they do reading, numeracy, and how to use documents. So one of the things that they find is that often youth don't know how to fill out passport documents or how to navigate through application forms or this kind of, we call it like, working literacy. And so really building that working literacy. And then do specific skills development training and career counseling. As I mentioned earlier, they do a 2-week training program at the Carpenters Millwrights College, and that has lots of stuff such as tool handling, power line hazard, fall protection, how to do insulation, and so on. They work for Train for Trades for 42 weeks on hands-on experience, and they do a Monday to Friday 9 to 4 work week. They do lots of retrofits, working in basements, insulating, demolitions, and construction such as, framing, insulating, creating barriers, working with electricians and plumbers, and doing so. The Train for Trades is a certified construction business, so that when they moved to employers, they found that employers that hired youth afterwards really valued that the youth were working in a certified business. And that had significant value in terms of their success rates. So they've had a 75% youth success rate in terms of youth who completed the program and have gone on to be employed or in a post-secondary education. They have decided to expand their social enterprise. So their social enterprise, their first one is this regular 42-week program attached with the Carpenters Millwright program, and that is retrofit work, and it continues. As youth go, they move them into, they can either find employment elsewhere, or they're expanding their enterprise to do project work. So they're meeting the market need, and then they're employing youth that have made it through the first stage of their enterprise and now moving into the second stage, and then they're developing a third stage, which is when they're employed long-term by Choices for Youth. So let me see where we at. Next slide. So when we look at employment social enterprise, this is just a snapshot that demonstrates that this is a growing sector. So you can see that and I would recommend anyone who's interested in sort of the state of the sector in BC to go and look at Peter Hall's paper that he's done, and it does a snapshot, and every 2 years he's doing a snapshot of the sector. And what we've learned is that, well, what he's really seen is that it's definitely growing. Where is it? So, so most that we have, about 40% of social enterprises are providing employment support. That there's two different types. There's ones that provide long-term employment, and there's ones that provide training and transition. But in BC alone, at least 2,430 people are employed by employment social enterprises as part of their mandate. And that, in terms of the training and transition, 6,250 have gone through those training programs or have been supported to provide employment. And we do see anecdotally similar rates of success, that people sort of talk between, I would say, like 60 to 80% of success in terms of finding subsequent employment or moving to post-secondary education. Now I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you. So assuming folks can hear me, just to, as Christy mentioned, Christy's really provided an introduction to the case studies that we conducted. But we also, did some other work around that. We did a literature review of both academic and gray literature around social enterprise, and specifically about how social enterprise is contributing to employment outcomes. And then we also really wanted to ground that in a local context, and so we did interviews with local employers and industry associations, and then also a focus group with employment developers to really better understand some of the unique dynamics in the labor market here, and also to understand how social enterprise is and or could be fitting into part of a strategy to address some issues around youth unemployment. And so what I'll present in the next few minutes is just a bit more information about what is social enterprise and what makes it unique. And then I'll say a little bit about how it fits into a developing response in the capital region. And so just to recap, as Christy mentioned, social enterprise really refers to quite a lot of different things. So oftentimes it's used to refer to what we call enterprising nonprofits, and so that's really when a nonprofit has a business attached to it that is a revenue generator. The focus is on revenue generation, and so an example of that would be like a museum gift shop or something like that. Of the whole world of social enterprise, employment social enterprises make up a subset of that. And employment social enterprises in Canada are about 40% of all social enterprises existing in Canada. And then within the world of employment-focused social enterprises, there's, as Christy mentioned, different approaches. There's those that focus on long-term employment and those that focus on transitional employment. And really what we have found from this work and some other work we've done with enterprising nonprofits is that those social enterprises that are working with youth are really focused on transitional employment for youth, so shorter-term employment. But what really makes social enterprise unique is that it's an approach that effectively combines many of the things that we already know about best practices in employment development into one model and into one location. And by doing so, it's able to create synergies and outcomes that, generally speaking, are not present or are not as strong when each of those interventions is delivered on its own. And so what you'll see is on your left just some of the best practices in employment development that we looked at. So programs that really address a range of skills development needs, so that's everything from life skills to workplace skills, or which is often called non-cognitive skills, that's sort of decision-making, customer service, conflict resolution type skills, job-specific skills, and then sort of life stabilization type things. Also, best practice in employment development is a focus on real work experience that helps people make up or overcome experience gaps. And then also, successful employment development practices have a strong focus on employer and practitioner partnerships to support employment outcomes. And what we found is that social enterprise mirrors many of those practices and also builds on those. And so, for example, throughout the research we did, we found that social enterprises include training in workplace and job skills in a setting that's integrated into the workplace. And this has been shown to be effective with social enterprises for a variety of reasons. And so some of the research suggests that it's really that combination of on-the-job training that allows people to apply the skills that they may have learned elsewhere. It's the intensity of contact, so you're in a workplace setting, maybe potentially full-time or for 8 hours a day. And it's the real-world accountability that's required of performance in a workplace, taken together, really contributes to an effective response. We also found that social enterprises really effectively integrate life skills and other wraparound supports, and so those other wraparound supports are the things like counseling, drug and alcohol addiction support, that type of thing. And that those supports are inherently embedded in the DNA of the social enterprise model, that's part of the modus operandi of social enterprises. We also found that many social enterprises are really well positioned to be able to provide that type of support because most do exist as an extension of a parent entity or a larger nonprofit organization that's already delivering that type of service and has likely developed a social enterprise to help meet a gap they see in how they're providing service to their clients. So they're working with young people already and they see that employment is a gap, so they've developed a social enterprise as a response to that, but continue to provide the support, say, otherwise we're providing. We also find that social enterprises are generally clustered in sort of entry-level positions, but not that necessarily end there, but create a ladder to future employment. And this is really important for young people, as Tom mentioned, who may lack the social capital or the networks to access jobs, because it helps them gain that critical work experience. But it also reduces what is sometimes seen as a risk by employers who don't want to invest necessarily in youth who may not have that track record of experience. And throughout our interviews with employers, many of them described taking this sort of test then invest approach in their employees. And social enterprise is a way of working with employers to help reduce that risk or perception of risk. We also find that social enterprises really focus on a partnership model that engages community-based organizations, employers, unions, social service organizations, in creating sort of a web of support around the young people who work there. And sometimes that looks like partnerships with post-secondary institutions, so they're doing a bit of formal accreditation and training. Sometimes it's partnerships with existing employers to sort of take on the youth after they graduate, or just to provide immersion experience. Loft Kitchen, for example, really focuses on tours of commercial kitchens in the Toronto area. But we do also find that this particular area is an area where social enterprises identify that they need more time and resources to really focus on building those critical networks, and those networks are so important when you're specifically focused on transitional employment social enterprises. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that, as Tom mentioned throughout his work, social enterprise is a really interesting solution to unemployment issues because it is a solution that addresses both supply and demand side issues. So social enterprises are creating jobs and they are embedded in the labor market. And this is critical, a critical shift in the way we think of employment programming. Taken together, all of this has huge impacts both on the people who work in social enterprises and on the communities that they're located in. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see that the social enterprises contribute to employment outcomes, skills development, sort of sense of efficacy and mastery. It helps people stabilize other aspects of their lives, but also because they're often located in disadvantaged communities or working with marginalized populations, they create jobs in communities that need them. They critically contribute to a perception shift between customers and clients and the employees of those organizations, and they reduce the overall impact on other areas of the social safety net. So just quickly to say, why were we interested in this research? And that's because there is a critical need in our community, and social enterprises are most effective at working with people who are sometimes considered the furthest from the labor market, people with multiple barriers to employment, and often social enterprise is identified as a really effective approach to work with youth who are called NEET. And that's young people who are not in employment, education, or training. And we looked at the data in the region and found that there's 4,000 young people, 15 to 24, who are considered not in employment, education, or in a labor force. So those are people who are young people who are not going to school and who are not working. So we wanted to hear from local employers about how social enterprise could contribute to a response. And what we found was interesting. We found that in our region, employers are, I would say, a little bit gun-shy about investing in employees because they fear losing them to LNG development, they fear losing them to Alberta, that type of thing. But that has also created a dynamic in which employers are increasingly interested in working in new ways and working to employ people who have been marginalized in the labor market in the past. So they're looking to employ people who have not been formally employed. We also found that everybody described a system of employment support that is very fragmented in our region. It's primarily delivered through community-based organizations, and that social enterprises can play a really important role in coordinating and networking some of those supports. And that we were heartened to hear that among employers there is a real strong desire to look at solutions and to look at new ways of working with social enterprises, and in particular, if social enterprises can help them meet some of their pre-training needs, that they would be keen to work in that type of partnership. So just some examples of a desire for a new strategy in the region, people talking about losing employees to the oil fields, the need to take care of what's in our backyard, and to look at employees that they hadn't previously looked at. So just to conclude, we have sort of two sets of recommendations, and one is for our region. We're recommending the development of an employment development network that includes social enterprises and mainstream employers in partnership, and looks at how social enterprises and existing supportive employers can expand or complement the work that they're already doing. And then that those can serve as an entry point into a network of employers that will take on some of those young people who have been pre-trained and sort of pre-screened through this social enterprise network. This is an opportunity for employers and social enterprises to share best practices and learn from each other, and then to bring in some of the research community and things like that to streamline the processes and make sure that we're actually meeting the training needs of employers. One of the things that came through in the interviews is that there's a real lack of concrete data in the region about labor market trends. That is a problem. And lastly, just on the research side, social enterprise is a rapidly developing field in Canada, and there's a lot known anecdotally and at the program level about the effectiveness of it, but there's been little work to sort of test it in a really rigorous way against other approaches, so we recommend that. And we also recommend a bit of research to learn more about the type and intensity of wraparound supports that are needed that have a real impact on young people's lives. So what does it mean when we say we're meeting youth where they're at? What interventions are the ones that are most critical? And then a little bit of work to understand how social enterprises build and maintain networks with employers to support employment development opportunities for young people. And I think I will wrap up there because we're out of time.
All right, thanks, Christy and Sarah. We do have a few minutes for questions. I will get to a couple here, but if you have any burning questions, please use that question field in your panel to submit them. The first comment is from Gil Reardigan, who is saying, first of all, she says that this would be so helpful in the Okanagan. She's wondering how staff at Work BC centers, how they could connect with social enterprises for their clients. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Christy, I don't know if you want to say something or...
I think that EPBC is trying to sort of figure out how to use sort of the work experience opportunities of social enterprise, and I think Open Door is doing an interesting model with Atira where Open Door provides wraparound supports, and Atira is providing some training. Atira is one of the social enterprises that does property management in Vancouver, and so they're combining sort of their assets to support people who have the multiple barriers, maybe specialized populations, and having a hard time getting into mainstream employment. I think that there is a great opportunity for EPBC providers to look at the social enterprises in your region, and there are social enterprises everywhere, and I'm sure that Kim Buxa at Enterprising Nonprofits would be able to point people towards where those enterprises are across BC, and then I would encourage to find a way to partner some of the training supports and some of the wraparound supports that EPBC can provide with the social enterprises that are there who will provide the employment and complement those training and wraparound as well.
Okay, thanks. We do have one specific question about your data. How did you arrive at the 4,000 NEETs in the capital region?
It's from the 2011 National Household Survey.
Okay.
So the data is in the report. Yeah.
Okay. So when that report comes out, you'll be able to see exactly. I think you have some other data in there as well. Mm-hmm. Another question from James Flum, asking how he can identify specific social enterprises in a local context, and in this case, it's Chilliwack. Do you have any thoughts on that?
How to identify them?
Yeah, how would you go about identifying specific social enterprises in a local area?
Yeah, I think that Christy's right that Enterprising Nonprofits is probably best placed to help you connect with those in your region, and also to look at the findings from Peter Hall's research. He has surveyed many of the social enterprises in British Columbia and has a database and a listing of who they are and what they do. There's not there's not a member-based organization for social enterprises in BC, so you have to do a little bit of digging to find them.
Okay. That's it for the questions. Thank you so much, Tom, Sarah, and Chrissy, for your presentations today. I'd also like to thank my colleague Greg Lockwood here for managing the technical side of this the webinar today. I want to thank all of you for attending. The session was recorded, and we will be posting the video of the presentation on our website, and we'll be providing an opportunity for you to continue the conversation there if you still have any further questions. You will receive an email tomorrow through the GoToWebinar software with a link to the presentation and video. Unfortunately, we have found that the system does not record those of you connecting only by phone as having attended, so you may receive an email saying that we're sorry that you were unable to attend. If that's the case and you'd like to get confirmation of your attendance for accreditation purposes, please contact us at the address in the email. As always, we welcome your input and feedback here at the center. We would also appreciate any suggestions you have for future webinar topics. A few quick announcements before we end today's session. Part 2 of the series will take place in exactly 2 weeks on September 10th. It will feature presentations by Mosaic on the value of paid or unpaid short-term work placements for refugee and immigrant youth, and one by McCreary Center Society on the barriers to employment experienced by vulnerable BC youth. We hope you can join us for that presentation. At the end of this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. It will take about 1 to 2 minutes, and your feedback will help us immensely for planning future webinars. If you participated in this session with a colleague or in a group, please select the most appropriate or common answers. Thank you in advance. That ends our webinar for today. On behalf of the BC Centre for Employment Excellence, thank you and have a great afternoon.